That was Nothing's What It Seems by Imani Hekima. Hello again, Resistors. Today is July 26th, 2011, one day before my 21st birthday, I might add. And you are tuned in to the WideShut Webcast on Resistance Radio. As always, I'm your host, Keelan Balderson, and you can find all of my work at wideshut.co.uk. And for everything Resistance Radio, that's resistradio.com. How's the sound tonight, everybody? Can you all hear me okay? Drop me a little hint in the chat if you can. I know we sometimes have problems here on the shoestring BTR platform, but it's the hand life has dealt us, unfortunately. Anyway, there's a lot we could get to this week. The phone hacking thing, this terror attack in Norway, which is already being manipulated and spun by the media. You know, they couldn't go with Muslims because the guy clearly wasn't a Muslim, although they did try to begin with. So now they're back with the old right-wing nationalist hating. And they've now got this nice little left-right paradigm to play with. You know, if you don't want bankers running the country, if you don't want corporations fiddling their taxes at the expense of the average person, if you don't want parasites like the royal family taking all your tax money, then you're an evil anarchist that wants to smash everything up. On the other side, if you don't want to be in the EU superstate, if you don't want unchecked and often unsustainable immigration, then they can label you a right-wing, racist, extremist, EDL supporter. And one article that kind of ties in with all of this that Mr. Britt posted on resistradio.com, fear of anarchist threat grows as countdown to London 2012 begins. It says organisers of next year's Olympics believe there is a greater threat of disruption to the Games from anarchist protesters than Islamist terrorism. And we've seen this already, the sort of branching out of the boogeyman to other groups, not just Muslims. We're on to more domestic-based groups now, whether that's the anarchist groups or the EDL, which reportedly has ties to this shooter, this Anders guy from Norway. And in his manifesto, he wrote about links between our government and the Islamic extremists, which is actually on record and is true and something I've tried to expose. So maybe I'm an extremist now. It's the same in the US. They had the MIAC report labeling Ron Paul supporters, veterans, libertarians, etc. as possible domestic extremists, domestic terrorists. And over here we had the Demos report saying conspiracy theories like the New World Order could act as a radicalizing multiplier, is what they said, within extremist groups, making them more radical. But it just boils down to one thing, folks. If you disagree with the system, if you want real change, then you're going to be labelled as one form of extremist, whether it's on the left or the right, this fake left-right paradigm. But switching gears before I start rambling, today we're going to be talking about the London bombings again, which of course helped spark groups like the EDL into action. We have this contrived Islamist threat that's manipulated for the West's gain, and then the EDL pops up as this phony opposition to that Islamist threat, and they've now come out and admitted their support for Israel, which raises a whole bunch of other questions about them. And then you have the leftists trying to target the EDL, even though they wouldn't know fascism if it hit them in the face, and you get this big divide and rule situation, while the real criminals continue with their agenda. And of course, last week I spoke with former police intelligence analyst Tony Farrell, who was essentially dismissed from his job because he no longer believed the official 9/11 and 7/7 stories. He discovered that the Islamist threat was manipulated and contrived. And today we're going to be talking to Tom Secker. Tom is an independent researcher and documentary filmmaker. His film 7/7 Seeds of Deconstruction, which I've mentioned a few times on here, it came out last year about the same time as mine did. Great film, not very speculative, not sensational in any way, just dealing with the facts, basically, which is what we try and do here on Resistance Radio. Not conspiracy porn, real issues with real facts and figures. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring Tom Secker on the air. Let me just unmute his microphone and see if this works. Hello, Tom. Can you hear me?
I can, Keelan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. You're live on the WideShut Webcast. How's it going?
Yeah, good. It's excellent to be here. Thanks for having me on.
No worries. Quickly, before we just get into your background and stuff, what's your take on this Norway attack? You know, contrived or not, they're definitely not going to let a crisis like this go to waste.
No, certainly not. I mean, whenever an event like this happens, there's always going to be those people who are seeking to exploit it, who are seeking to use it to further an agenda. I'm not sure where I stand on it, because so far you've got the, broadly speaking, official narrative that this was a guy working more or less on his own, who is some kind of Christian fundamentalist, neo-Nazi, whatever. I mean, these labels are being thrown around, but exactly what he believed is not very clear at this point. And then you have the alternative narratives coming out that this was some kind of false flag. Now, I think the guy did do it. I think he carried out that bombing and those shootings. Yeah. But there probably is more to this story. There are probably more co-conspirators in his background that we have sort of been hinted at so far, but we haven't really had any clarification on. So I certainly think there's more to it than what we've heard already. Certainly a lot more to it.
Yeah, well, I think someone else must know, what he was up to. He must have had some circle of contacts or whatever. But we'll leave that topic for now until, more developments come out. But for listeners that might not be familiar with you and your film, Seeds of Deconstruction, why don't you give us just a quick profile of you, why you made the film, what you were hoping to achieve, etc.?
Well, I mean, it all started, I suppose, when 7/7 started. I was one of those people who was, if you like, skeptical straight away. It wasn't until a couple of years after that I really took the time to sit down and go through the films that had already been made and go through the J7 website and things like that and sort of formulated any kind of strong opinion about this. But I mean, for a long time I've had this history, this interest in the history of black ops and covert ops of various kinds, and so I was always aware that, things like this can still be going on now. This isn't just history, this is just the prelude to the present. So when I looked at 7/7, I couldn't find anything that was kind of slap bang in your face, this proves that it was some kind of black op, but it always struck me as a distinct possibility, and the way that they've covered up so much information kind of only adds to that suspicion. It's almost as though they want us to believe that it was some kind of inside job or whatever.
Right.
So about 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, I sat down and kind of went through it in my head. What have the films that have been made on 7/7 already covered? Where have they got to? What's happened since then? What have they not had time to cover? And how can I fit all this together and put something out there of my own that I think adds to this and adds to people's understanding of it?
Well, I think you did a great job on that, and you mentioned the history, and I think a lot of people listening will have struggled when trying to broach the topic of contrived terrorism with people. The idea that a terror attack on this country may actually benefit elements within the government and within the establishment. It's always hard to try and explain that sort of that system that people aren't aware of, and a good way of doing that is bringing up the history of some of these operations that have happened in the past. Common ones people will bring up is perhaps Hitler burning his own Reichstag, blame it on the communists, as some historians have said, or people might talk about Pearl Harbor and certain elements of prior knowledge. But in your film, you had quite a number of examples that I don't think are probably well known, but show in a modern sense how our governments do operate. So maybe you can just give us a few of those examples of the false flags you brought up in your film.
Well, I mean, one of the most important ones was the last one I dealt with in the sort of first half of the film, which was in, I think it was September 2005. It was a couple of months after 7/7, when you have these British SAS officers in Basra running around dressed up as Arabs, as Muslims, driving around in a car that has explosives and weapons inside it. Something went wrong. They ended up shooting up a police checkpoint and trying to drive off, trying to escape. They got arrested, slung in a Basra jail, then transferred out of the jail, it seems, because the British Army then sent in the heavy lads, the tanks and armoured personnel carriers and what have you, caused a huge riot. Lots of people got killed and injured. But that all seems to have been a diversion. That took place near the jail, but they actually rescued them from a house in Basra. Now, I think this is a great example because this sort of shows you what happens when a black op, when a false flag, particularly black op, goes wrong. And what happens is usually you get a huge diplomatic fallout from it, and you get spiralling violence because no one trusts anyone after this happened, and Basra has been largely a bloodbath since then, and was for a time before, of course. But this certainly contributed to, if you like, destabilizing Iraq. I don't think they intended it that way. I do think this was a black op that went wrong, but what the hell they were up to in the first place, well, I'm not entirely sure on that one, but it certainly wasn't anything very pleasant or very peaceful. I think we can be sure of that much.
No, and they're always trying to destabilize, their countries that will give them, strategic power. Islam has always been used as a tool by the establishment. The Mujahideen thing with the Soviets, then Kosovo, and even now in Libya, we're supporting rebels that essentially were trying to kill our soldiers. Just a few years before that. I mean, it's quite a ludicrous story.
Absolutely, yeah. Go on, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, some other examples of false flags. Obviously, Operation Northwoods, which came out, suggesting that they should carry out false flags and blame it on Cuba and things like that. And then you touched on some things with Castro in your film as well. Maybe you want to quickly sort of go over some of that.
Well, sure. I mean, Castro was... still is largely, I mean, it's his brother now, but it's the same family, communist leader of Cuba who came to power in the late 50s. The Americans initially tried to deal with him. I mean, they had, to some extent, through the CIA, funded his insurgency, his revolution. But Castro was having none of it. He was too ideologically committed to not getting along with the Americans. So the first big operation that they did was at the Bay of Pigs, which where they got a couple of thousand Cuban exiles, people who'd fled Cuba to Florida, trained them up as kind of paramilitaries, as insurgents, landed them on a beach, and they started to fight the Cuban army. And the whole thing went horribly wrong because they basically just got decimated. I mean, it was horrible. But what came out of that was a thing called Operation Mongoose. This was a kind of overarching black op that took place. It had elements of CIA, elements of the Pentagon, all sorts of people working together. And one of the various plans that came out of Operation Mongoose was Northwoods, was this idea that they could stage a whole series of different kinds of attacks, blame the whole thing on Cuba, and use it as a pretext for invading Cuba for real, rather than just using a couple of thousand insurgents that they'd as a proxy, that they would actually, roll the full US military in there and just take over the place and depose Castro that way. And one of the things that I was trying to get at in my film is that, a fair few people know about Operation Northwoods. I mean, there's the documents online. It's been covered in various documentaries, all the rest of it. But it's important, I think, to understand that came out of a long process of covert operations. That wasn't just some isolated plan that, got knocked on the head because they thought it was a bit extreme. They, this was what they were doing for years.
And it was also, I believe, the first time they mentioned the idea of hijacking planes and doing things like that, which is often sort of used to, build up the idea that 9/11 wasn't what we were told, and that's a line in take. But you're also, I believe, like me, working on a new 7/7 film. So what sort of angle are you taking the new film? I know we both sort of covered historical aspects of false flags and things. But what are you looking to show us in the new film?
Well, the difference is that in the first film, I was mainly looking at the question, in simple terms, could 7/7 have been a black op? Not necessarily a false flag, but some kind of black op. And obviously the question that the answer I came up with to that question was yes, of course it could be. I'm not saying it necessarily was, but of course it could be. In this film, rather than looking at it in just specifically the kind of black op history context, I'm trying to approach the question of how is it that the judicial system, the police, the prosecution service, the courts, all the rest of it, how do they deal with the fallout of black ops, with the fallout of these undercover games being played by Special Branch and MI5 and all the rest of it? So I'm looking at several examples whereby radical movements have been infiltrated and manipulated and provoked into doing things so that the people could then be, prosecuted, or where they did it to actively produce violence. Like in Northern Ireland, you have this situation where they were not only infiltrating the IRA, their supposed enemy, they were also infiltrating the loyalists and directing them against the Republicans and, murdering innocent civilians in a lot of cases. So you get two things that come out of this process that I see. You get violence, you get innocent people dead, and you get miscarriages of justice. You get the police and the prosecution service chasing and hounding and quite often prosecuting and convicting and imprisoning the wrong bloody people. And this happens, it seems, more often than not. So again, in that question, the simple question would be, could they have got the wrong people? Have they just, for whatever reason, conspiratorial or whatever, have they just got the wrong people in 7/7? Ask that question, and then I suppose the majority of the film will be looking at the inquest's evidence in light of that question, in that context.
And you mentioned the Irish Troubles there. I think a lot of people, the internet has kind of grown up after the whole Irish Troubles, and when people are kind of looking into 9/11 and 7/7, they don't always realise that there was all these sort of terror attacks going on, close to home. The biggest one before 7/7 was the Omar bombings, and that's got all sorts of dubious things going on with it. I mean, there's been whistleblowers coming out and say, the security services and whatnot had men on the inside, and things were allowed to go ahead even though they knew about it, and all these kind of things. So it has been going on for a long time.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the earliest example that I'm looking at, and I'm perhaps being a bit nerdy in going back this far, is the case of the anarchists in the late Victorian period, in the late 19th century. These aren't, today's cake shop smashing anarchists. These were, genuine radicals, some of them, and some of them were violent. I'm not disputing that. But some of them were just radical thinkers. They were just people who were sort of on the fringes, if you like, of the labour movement and kind of the fallout of Marxism and all of that kind of thing. And this whole movement was infiltrated by spies. I mean, you had the anarchist journal, the Commonweal. At one point, it seems that almost everyone who worked on it was an informant, but most of them didn't know that the rest of them were informants. So they were all informing on each other when none of them were really up to anything. And again, out of this process, what we see is some violence, some very real bombings that are the fallout of this infiltration, and also miscarriages of justice, like that of the Walsall anarchists. I wrote a piece on my blog about this a little while ago, but, if you look up the Walsall anarchists in particular, if you just Google them, you'll find all sorts of information that shows that this is a very, very long-established tactic. This isn't anything new at all.
Have you got a release date for the new film, or are you just kind of trying to get it done by the end of the year, or?
I'm hoping to get the sort of preliminary version done by the end of August with a bit of luck, so hopefully it will be available around the start of September, but I can't promise anything because you know what it's like being a filmmaker. Yeah. Everything seems to take longer than you anticipated.
And people will be able to find that on the 7/7 archive YouTube channel, I'd assume, and
yeah.
Your blogs, the Howard Beale's News Hour on Blogspot.
Mm-hmm. It'll be available there. It'll be available several other places too.
Also, I wanted to ask you today. I don't really want to, say the state of the 7/7 Truth Movement, because there are a lot of well-meaning people doing a lot of work, but there's also sort of a long track record of people being discredited and made to look quite foolish by the media, which I think is harming our credibility. We've got people like former MI5 agent David Shayler suddenly dressing like a woman and saying he's the Messiah, just completely ruining his credibility and the film that he did. Then we have this John Hill guy who made Ripple Effect, who for some reason calls himself Muad'Dib and also thinks he's some kind of Messiah. I mean, nobody's perfect. I'm not trying to attack anybody here. We all make mistakes in our information and stuff, but this is an info war, and you can't run around giving the media things to discredit you on, like on a platter. So I was just kind of wondering what your take is on this whole Messiah syndrome that seems to be taking over 7/7 Truth.
Well, I think that the important thing to realise here is you're absolutely right. It does give the mainstream media, the self-styled conspiracy debunkers, the David Aronoviches of this world, something to hit, a nice, easy target to aim at. And that is a problem. It's a problem strategically, but it's also a problem in terms of motive. You've got to wonder, not necessarily does this actually discredit what they're saying, because frankly, John Hill, David Shayler, they can think what they like, and they can, dress up in as many flowery dresses as they like and do whatever else it is that they want. That doesn't necessarily, to us, to people who aren't, conditioned by the mainstream media to just reject conspiracy, but for us, it doesn't discredit what they're saying. So we shouldn't allow ourselves to fall into that trap of in any way dismissing Mind the Gap or Ripple Effect on the basis of the people who presented them. We should study them on their own terms and on the terms that we find important, the ones where we actually try and look at evidence in order to deduce truth and in order to apply pressure for proper inquiry. So I wouldn't... Yeah, you're right. We don't want to criticize these people personally. Not at all. I have no ill will towards them. But we have to wonder, I suppose, at what are their motives in this whole situation, because it doesn't literally and logically discredit what they're saying, but it does strategically discredit what they're saying, because, like you say, it gives the debunkers something very easy to aim at. So what's more important to these people, I suppose, is the question that perhaps we should be asking them. Is it the truth about 7/7, or is it having a platform on which you can stand around saying that you're the Messiah? Because, to be honest, you can't really have both. It's either one or the other.
Yeah, what is your opinion on the Ripple Effect film? Because we seem to have developed two kind of camps. There's one that's asking questions, looking at all the different sides to the story and saying, look, this is dodgy. I don't know exactly what happened, but it's not the way the government said it was. Then there's another camp that's convinced the alleged bombers were actors, were set up, were part of this big drill, they were shot at Canary Wharf, and they seem to present it as if they have all the answers. But I think you'll agree that it's not as easy as that, is it?
No, it's not as easy as that at all, and there's a lot of different directions you could go with this. But I think the fundamental one is if we are applying our critical faculties to the official narrative, and I'm not just talking about the actual narrative document that's only about 50 pages long and is a load of complete tosh, but I mean the official narrative as weaved by the mainstream media in particular. If we're applying our critical faculties to that, then we also should be applying our critical faculties to any other narrative that emerges and asking, well, does this best represent the truth? Because it's not like, if all we want to do in this is trash the official narrative and then jump on the back of a conspiracy theory, then we're wasting everyone's time. What John Hill is saying in Ripple Effect, and the other people who made that film too are saying in the Ripple Effect, I suppose could be true, but there isn't very much evidence for it in terms of sort of the kind of hard evidence that you would be able to take into a courtroom and use this as a means of winning motions and pursuing legal cases and all of that kind of thing. All it really does is present a somewhat plausible narrative that could be true or might not be true. My own feeling is it probably isn't true, and I'll give you my reasons for this if you like. You start out with the bombers, the alleged bombers, were not bombers at all. they were patsies. They weren't in those locations. They weren't on those trains. They weren't on that bus. They did not blow up bombs there. What the ripple effect narrative says is that they were actors of some sort, and they thought that they were playing a role in a terrorism training drill, in the Peter Power terrorism training drill. But aside from the fact that there is no evidence whatsoever connecting these four men to Peter Power, to Visor Consultants, to Reed Elsevier or anyone else involved in this, aside from that sort of absence of positive evidence, we've got some evidence going against it, and that would be the general paranoia of young British Muslim males towards anyone involved in the security services. You know, it's not the easiest thing to go out there and find four young British Muslim men who are willing to play the role of fake terrorists. They'd have to be pretty trusting, and I would also say pretty naive, to agree to do that. And these aren't people who are just, you know, totally ordinary, unsuspecting young British Muslims. These are people who are surrounded in many ways by, if you like, Muslim radicals. I don't like the term, I don't like the label, but that's what they appear to be, at least. I mean, half of these supposedly Muslim radicals happen to be double agents as well. But the point is, a lot of them got arrested in the Crevice plot, in the fertilizer plot. You had Omar Khayyam and Salahuddin Amin and all of the rest of them in the Operation Crevice investigation. They were arrested in, March, April 2004. So you're talking a little over a year before 7/7. Now, if you were a young British Muslim male, already somewhat predisposed to skepticism and perhaps even conspiracy theories about the security services, which a lot of them are, and a bunch of your friends suddenly get swooped on by the security services and snapped up and chucked in prison, and you're told they're going to be put on trial, you'd probably suspect that they might be watching you too. And you wouldn't be very likely to go and say, yes, Mr. Peter Power, I'll play your fake terrorist, I'll wear a backpack. It just doesn't add up to me. And there's a kind of, if you like, a manipulation of plausibility of narrative that's going on here, that instead of looking at the background of these four guys, and if you're trying to, you know, create an inside job narrative, if you look into the background of these four guys, you find all these double agents, and you find all these informants, and you find all this, you know, strange stuff going on that indicates that at least some kind of official manipulation was at work. But instead of looking at all of that, the people who really push the ripple effect narrative only really bang on about the exercise. They don't bang on about the double agents. And that bugs me, because if you're trying to create that inside job narrative, I think the double agents are the best evidence, because we have lots more evidence and information about them. If you're, you know, just trying to create a nice, simple story, then sure, the exercise fits, but does it really even mean anything?
I think that's the problem with the kind of, I don't even like the word inside job. It's trying to simplify everything. And even if, you know, the bombers the alleged bombers did do it, which I think is highly likely, and we should obviously be open to that possibility. We shouldn't just shut down all this other information because, you know, we've developed this other narrative, like you say. There is all that history there, and it's not easy to go through everything and find out what really did happen. Tying it up in a neat little bow is not going to help. There's obviously different kinds of false flag attack. It doesn't mean Tony Blair told some army guys to get on a train and blow it up. These things have much wider context, like you say.
Sure, and there's a lot of different types of covert ops. I mean, you say you don't particularly like the term inside job, and to be honest, I don't either, because I think it's overused to the point of being almost meaningless now. And to be honest, false flag is heading that way too. People use these terms interchangeably, to the point where they're not really drawing any distinction between degrees of governmental complicity or degrees of governmental liability. And that's, you know, if we're ever going to win this thing, if we're ever going to get a proper inquiry, and if we're ever going to get proper prosecutions, then we have to, at least to some extent, adhere to the legal process that we already have. And that means, you know, being able to draw these fundamental distinctions. You know, if those 4 guys were actually found in those 4 locations and their bodies were actually blown up in those explosions, that doesn't necessarily mean they did it and were intentional suicide bombers, but it probably means that they had something to do with it. Now, the evidence for that is very, very shaky. I'm sure you've seen the stuff that's come out of the inquests about, you know, none of them actually being pronounced dead at the scene and things like this that just make you wonder, well, you know, were they ever even there? But if we assume for the sake of argument that they were there, then it's extremely statistically unlikely that they weren't involved in some way. And so if that turns out to be the case, if that is actually true, then we just need to accept that, move on to the next questions, because there are lots of different degrees of questions and degrees of implication in all of this that we need to be aware of and that we need to fight on those terms, if you like, because otherwise they won't listen to us, because we'll just be a bunch of people waving a flag.
And I think that's the problem. People write their books or they make their films and they get almost emotionally attached to the narrative that they've made, and if it ever becomes discredited, it becomes awfully hard to sort of go back on, you know, all this effort that you put in. I mean, one example you could give is Nick Kolostrom, author of Terror on the Tube. He was adamant that the alleged 7/7 bombers, you know, entering Luton Station, they didn't really enter it because this picture was dodgy. And the picture was dodgy. It looked, you know, really, really odd. But because he then wanted to speculate that none of the bombers were even in London, and this picture proved that, it allowed the BBC to swoop in and say, look, we've now got this CCTV evidence, you're a lunatic. And it's that sort of going beyond the evidence that kind of discredits people, even if they're well-meaning, even if they were right to sort of raise these questions.
Well, at the point that Nick Kolostrom was saying that, we did have very, very little by way of CCTV footage. I think we only had 3 pictures, and to be honest, none of them really showed anything of any consequence. And sure, that one of them walking into, well, supposedly the 4 alleged bombers walking into Luton Station, didn't look particularly authentic, but there wasn't anything in it that I could see from someone, you know, I've worked in jobs where we run CCTV systems. I know that they're pretty shoddy. There was nothing in it that I thought conclusively showed that it was fake. And they did somewhat pull the rug out from under him by then releasing a whole reel of CCTV from Luton Station that kind of shows a continuous sequence and shows that, well, they'd either have to fake the entire thing, but why would they fake video that doesn't show anything incriminating? Or that video just is real. It is authentic. And it could well be. I mean, like I say, it doesn't show anything of any significance. So, to me, that's the far better argument to make than to say that it's fake.
Some people in the chat are bringing up some good points.
Go on.
You know, along the lines of, you know, they're sticking to their narrative, but there's also all this other evidence. You know, they're bringing up Q and Harun Aswat and Babar and stuff. There are all these sort of assets and suggested assets that are on the periphery influencing the alleged bombers before the attack. So, like we've said, you can't dismiss that they weren't involved because there is this kind of backstory that would have suggested that they were involved. And people can say, well, all of that was just put there, it was made up, it was a fabricated history. But, you know, where do you draw the line then? I mean, is the whole world just made up? You've got to find the specific evidence to make claims. You know what I mean? So,
well, one thing I'd say about that is that, yeah, a lot of that stuff is somewhat incriminating. It does suggest that these 4 guys, or at least Mohammed Sadiq Khan and Shazad Tanweer at any rate, were to some extent involved in the radical Islamic movements in the UK. That, of course, doesn't make them suicide bombers. There's plenty of people involved in those movements who are entirely non-violent. But, yeah, okay, a lot of that backstory could be fabricated, but if it has been fabricated, it's been fabricated by people like Mohammed Junaid Babar, because he's testified in court about, you know, running this terrorism training camp in Pakistan, and that apparently Mohammed Sadiq Khan went there and received terrorism training. Now, I don't know if that was true. I wasn't at that camp, so how would I know? But, yeah, okay, so it could be fabricated, but then we're left with, well, an FBI informant is fabricating things about one of them after they're dead. which doesn't exactly ring true. It doesn't exactly make you think, oh, that means the official version must be true. Because, if you've caught someone in a lie, well, you've caught them in a lie. So that's the kind of best-case scenario that you can come out with from the Mohammed Junaid Babar story.
Yeah, and they're also bringing up in the chat was it the Ikra bookshop in Leeds, which had two characters which, well, one kind of former army who suddenly became some kind of, radical, and then we had Martin Gilbertson that claimed that he sent stuff to the police to warn them. So, there's even more kind of people in the background that we can't be too sure about, but that need a closer inspection.
Oh, certainly. And, Gilbertson would be another great example, because virtually nothing Gilbertson has ever said about 7/7 is actually true. So he may have fabricated this whole thing. He may have just made up this whole story about having sent stuff to the West Yorkshire police, or he may not have done. But in any case, it's kind of irrelevant, because, as you say, there was this other figure at the Ikra bookshop, Martin McDade, who is supposedly ex-Special Boat Service, ex-British Special Forces, converted to Islam, becomes a white, British militant Muslim. That kind of transition has never been explained at all, and is precisely the sort of thing that you would expect the security services to do if they were going to put someone in as a kind of deep cover agent, is that they would have them convert to Islam a few years earlier and, start getting on the bandwagon to give them some credibility, and then actually go in and start spying on people. So there's every possibility that McDade was a spy. And the thing is, the West Yorkshire police were following him since, I think, 1998. So it makes no difference that whether or not Gilbertson sent any stuff to the police 5 years later. They were following them already. They had tons of information on what was going on up in Leeds.
Because presumably, if McDade was a spy, he would have been sending them information about these guys. And if he wasn't, then what the hell was he doing?
Well, and even if he wasn't, then they were following him since 1998 anyway. So they knew all about him.
Well, since our films were released, we've obviously had the Lady Justice Hallett's inquest. July 7th.co.uk tried to make her aware of some of the important questions, but I think that mostly fell on deaf ears. MI5 basically tried their hardest not to play ball and have mostly succeeded in that. What was your take on the inquest?
Well, I think it was relatively clear from the first few days that this was, a bit of a sham inquest, to be honest. The whole purpose of an inquest, legally speaking, is to determine who has died, how, when, and where they died, and, to some extent, why they died. And it seems that basically all of these questions either weren't subject to any examination whatsoever, or they just presumed from the off that they knew the answer, and therefore the whole thing was a complete waste of everyone's time. And this is particularly kind of worrying, because you've got the relatives of all these people who died, and I'm talking about the alleged bombers' relatives as well as the other people. They've had to wait 5 years for this, and they've had to wait 5 years to be told essentially what they'd been told for the previous 5 years anyway. I mean, what was the point in dragging them through all that? Was it all just a kind of, a show? Was it all just for the media, so that the media could spend 5, 6 months going, yes, these 4 guys did it, and they were suicide bombers, and blah, 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 and just say that over and over again for another 6 months and hope that people will believe it? I mean, because apart from that, they didn't seem to achieve a damn thing.
And there's still lots of basic questions that aren't accurately answered. I mean, even the types of explosives that we use, the story changed multiple times, and then we know there isn't really even a link from the blast sites to the supposed bomb factory. And then there's the thing about where everybody was actually located in the trains themselves. I mean, I believe you talked about this before, the fact that they used computer models for some of this stuff. I mean, is this a case of just crap in, crap out? They just put in what they wanted to show everybody, or what's your take on that?
My take on that is that it is remarkable how little of the crucial evidence we actually have. If you were going to make the case that those guys, those 4 alleged bombers, made the devices themselves in that flat up in Leeds, and then drove down in those cars, and then jumped on the train to London and all the rest of it and blew themselves up in those locations, then the absolutely fundamental evidence you would need to have is some kind of forensic evidence showing that they were at all of those locations, and the evidence connecting them to the alleged bomb factory is very shoddy. They found plenty of their fingerprints there, but they didn't find their fingerprints on anything that was incriminating. They just found them on ordinary, everyday household items. Same kind of story in the car, in the Nissan Micra that they apparently left in Luton Station car park. Again, they found fingerprints and DNA, but they only found them on, carrier bags and biros and things like that. So then you get to London and they tell you, well, we don't actually have any traces whatsoever at any of the 4 bomb sites of what actually exploded. We don't have any initiator, we don't have any bomb case, we don't have any chemical residues from the explosion. So where are they getting this narrative of that's how the explosions were caused? Then you have the issue of these 4 guys' bodies. The process by which the bodies were recovered and identified was ruled sort of outside of the boundaries of the inquests, which is absurd and horrifying, to be honest, because what more appropriate question is there? If you're trying to establish who has died and when and where, surely you have to have a body and you have to have some kind of chain of custody that shows how that body was recovered and identified as the person you're saying it is. That process we basically have almost no evidence on, and the evidence we do have is really shoddy. And then even beyond that, you would have to be able to establish that those explosions took place in those 3 tube carriages and on that bus, right next to the people who supposedly set them off. And that, in particular, makes absolutely no bloody sense from all of these computer models and all of these sketches that witnesses did, and all of these diagrams of what damage was caused to the coaches. And furthermore, in most of the cases, it doesn't even match up with where the official narrative says these guys were. They're sat in the wrong seats, or they're on the wrong side of the coach, or, they're in the wrong part of the coach. So it's that profound absence of absolutely critical evidence and this reliance on sort of much more ambiguous evidence, like those supposedly jihadi martyrdom videos that were left behind. That's what the whole narrative seems to be based on, is sort of, suspicious and incriminating interpretation of ambiguous evidence, rather than straightforward, unambiguous interpretation of basic evidence. So we seem to be getting lost in all of this.
Yeah, and obviously the media, when a new video comes out of them shopping at B&Q, and the media runs with that, look, this is where they bought their stuff for the bombs, and it's like, well, what's the actual evidence that any of that material was at at the blast sites? There isn't really any. So it seems to be an inquest for the media to sort of close the book on, and they're going to hope that everyone just goes away, but we won't go away. And we're bringing out new films. I mean, Tony Farrell, say what you will about him, but I mean, he's the person with perhaps a little bit of weight that is now kind of behind the campaign. But
yeah, there's some potential there. Yeah.
What do you think we can do? What is kind of the next move for 7/7 Truth? Do you think we should still be fighting for a full inquiry, or is that sort of long past by now?
No, I think we should still be fighting for that. We should expand the pressure that's being applied from the government, in particular the Home Office, because they're the ones who anonymously wrote that narrative, but also to the police, because it's the police and the prosecution service who have, chased up 3 guys who had absolutely nothing to do with 7/7, slapped them in prison for a couple of years and subjected them to 2 trials on the basis of really flimsy evidence. Things like that. That is a great way to show that the establishment, the government, the police, the prosecution people, all of them are to some extent complicit in forcing this story onto the public and not giving a damn about the fallout for innocent people. And it will, I think that emotively is a good way of getting people to think, we need to be applying more pressure here. We need to be, en masse demanding a release of evidence and a proper inquiry into this. I don't think the time for an inquiry has passed whatsoever, because if you go back to the Gladio thing, Operation Gladio, this whole kind of lengthy Cold War black op that was going on in all sorts of different countries, a lot of those cases were not solved until 12 years, 15 years, 20 years after they'd happened, sometimes even more than that. But what did come out of it was a European Parliament resolution condemning the fact that this had happened, and that's historic. It's historic that they even admitted that it happened, let alone outright condemned it. But also several different parliamentary inquiries in different European countries. So it can be done. And those inquiries were not perfect, but they got to the heart of the matter. And successful prosecutions came out of that for people who had actually committed serious crimes. So it is possible to do this. However, kind of doubtful I might be that this is going to happen in this country, I've got to maintain some faith, because it's happened in other places. So we should keep up the pressure for that. The other future for the 7/7 Truth movement, I think, does lie in, if you like, in self-criticism. That we've got to realise, why is it that we've got to this point where they can hold these basically sham inquests that don't fulfil their legal obligations, that don't do what they're supposed to be doing? You know, how is it that we've got to a point that that can happen, and there aren't huge numbers of people leaping up and saying, this is horseshit? And there should be. There really, really should be. So we've got to have a little bit of self-criticism, and we've got to think, you know, where can we innovate here? Where can we do things where we draw on past campaigns that have been successful, and also draw on the failures of campaigns that have been unsuccessful, like, well, I don't know, not that I'm trying to slag anyone off here, but like the Stop the War Coalition. What the hell have they achieved? You know,
right.
people on the streets, big demonstrations, and I completely agree with what they're saying, but the wars are still going on and they're expanding. So that hasn't worked, and we have to come to terms with that, and we have to, you know, apply our critical modes to ourselves and say, we can do better than this. I don't have all the answers, because I'm a researcher and filmmaker. That's what I can do. But there's plenty of other people who can do other things. And we need to try and get more of them involved and have this as a more kind of broad-ranging movement, a broad-ranging, you know, pressure from lots of different angles on different parts of the establishment so that they have nowhere to turn.
I think we do maybe have a few new inroads into sort of getting this out there. I mean, we've had the phone hacking scandal, and it came out that 7/7 victims were phone hacked. And there's this character, I hope I've got his name right, I hope I'm not saying somebody else, but Andy Heyman, I think his name is. And he was kind of in charge of when that whole Jean-Charles Jimenez thing, and he was kind of brought in for this hearing about the phone hacking. And there's certain things, you know, we can maybe sort of inroads to expose people to this wider body of information, I think.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, this goes beyond 7/7. As passionate as I am about those attacks, this does go beyond that, because there's plenty of other effects apart from the tragic killing of 56 people. So there are lots of other ways that we can, provide people with this information and inspire their skepticism, and also inspire, to some extent, you know, their anger. Try and, you know, motivate them to think, I'm not going to just take this. I'm going to do something about it. Because, like I say, I'm not really the activist type. I'm not the type to go out and wave a placard on the street. And it's not that I'm having a go at people who do that at all. But, you know, I'm just not that sort of person. But there's plenty of people who are that sort of person, and done in the right way, and done in combination with lots of other strategies, these things can ultimately work. So you're right that, you know, the phone hacking scandal is brilliant as an example of this, because it shows the complicity between the establishment, the Metropolitan Police, and the mainstream media, the News International, Rupert Murdoch and all of that. And the fact that the police it seems, are so willing to sort of lie, not just to cover their own asses, but to cover the asses of journalists. That's already induced a lot of anger and a lot of skepticism about what the hell's really going on in this country, and who's really running things and how they're really running things. So, yeah, it's a great kind of, if you like, icebreaker for generating these kinds of conversations and saying, well, what about these injustices against supposed terrorists who are completely innocent? And if those supposed terrorists were completely innocent, then what about 7/7? Were those 4 alleged bombers completely innocent? You can sort of generate some more interest in things if you approach it from different angles. I absolutely agree with you there.
What I would like to see is perhaps some kind of people's inquiry, where we don't necessarily have to go to big daddy government to get this information out there. Why can't we just gather all the researchers in the 7/7 truth community and get people perhaps like Nafis Ahmed or whatever? I mentioned this to Tony Farrell. Why can't we all collectively write a report, have some kind of conference, invite guests that have maybe the average person, and get some kind of... Have we lost...
Sorry, Keelan, I lost you there for a moment.
Yeah, BTR is a little bit of a shooting budget. I was just saying, why can't we just really and put on some kind of... I don't want to say conference, that sounds a little silly,
no.
But do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. What I think about that is... The problem is, it's the state that has the funding, the access to expertise, and the legal standing to, subpoena records, call witnesses and force them to answer questions, all of that kind of thing. That's why a properly done, as in independent of the Inquiries Act and all of the other regulation around inquiries, if you could get an inquiry run with state backing, but without that kind of undue influence, without that kind of corruption, that would be the best thing that we go for. But I understand that, in all likelihood, probably won't ever take place, certainly not in Britain anyway. So I'm very much open to the prospect of a civilian sort of citizens' inquiry into 7/7 and indeed into the whole war on terror thing. I have no objection to that whatsoever, and I think if we could get that, even if nothing else, it would be great for propaganda purposes. It would be great for saying, look how big this thing has become, look how much evidence there is, and maybe that itself could be a preliminary step to getting a proper public inquiry that's run by the state but done in the right way. I have no objection to that idea at all. I'm all for it. I just think it would face the inevitable problems of having no money, having very little access to expertise, and not being able to force people to answer the proper questions. And that's where it would fall down, probably.
Well, I mean, these kind of ideas, we can all try and do our best and see where it takes us. Switching gears quickly, I was checking your blog earlier today, and I noticed you did an article on the death of Bin Laden, and he's obviously a big character in this whole war on terror, this kind of media creation. What's your opinion, Jeff? I mean, I did a big story on it. The US government are obviously very sort of guarded where they're concerned. They claim to have thrown him overboard the sea. No one's allowed to see any images. It's all a little dodgy to me.
Well, I mean, the whole existence of Bin Laden is a bit dodgy, isn't it? I mean, the guy did actually, there was actually an Osama Bin Laden. I'm not saying that, it was made up to that extent. And, he was involved with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan as part of Operation Cyclone and all the rest of it. But in the early 90s, he sort of disappeared off to the Sudan for about 5 years and didn't seem to achieve very much in that period. He then turns up again in Afghanistan in about 1996, supposedly plans and funds and helps mastermind 9/11, although, there's no evidence of that, so he probably didn't. And then he kind of became if you like, a sort of virtual terrorist. He existed only in voice recordings and in videos and pictures and things. No one actually, it seemed, met with Bin Laden after, well, roughly, the US invasion of Afghanistan in late 2001. And there was reports straight away that, Bin Laden had died in, I think, November 2001. And it's certainly true that very, very little was heard of him in the 10 years between then and now, when the US government are officially going around saying he's actually dead, we got him. So, yeah, I suppose, what do I think on that? I think that the whole thing has been a sort of narrative, or not from start to finish, but for a long, long time. For most of the last decade, Bin Laden is a virtual entity, and so all they seem to have done now is scripted this virtual entity out of their virtual dialogue about virtual terrorism. So,
right. And of course, we've got this this new contradiction to the official story of 7/7, because I believe one of the mainstream media reports quoting some American kind of bigwig says that Bin Laden, after all, may have had a role in 7/7 from his compound, which is, you know, just kind of... Have we lost Tom again?
No, I'm here. That's very thin, isn't it? That a guy sat scared in a house in a small town in Pakistan next to a military base somehow had contact with these three guys from Leeds and a guy from Aylesbury. I mean, what kind of possible evidence could there be that indicates that that's true?
But it's an official source, Tom.
Is this another one of those anonymous official intelligence sources that no one ever traces? Yeah, they seem to take a lot of interest in what goes into the news, don't they? They seem to be phoning up these newspapers all the time, giving these off the record anonymous briefings and telling what to print. Yeah.
Last year, they were saying that Bin Laden was held up in Iran. So, you know, you just see all these propaganda stories thrown out there about Bin Laden. I mean, there's no way of verifying anything about the man, really. It's quite
certainly
ridiculous.
not in recent years. No, there isn't. And yeah, so that's what makes me think that, you know, this is a guy who largely exists as a Western propaganda tool, as a, you know, Emmanuel Goldstein or whatever. And so when he died, obviously I don't know how long Bin Laden's been dead, but I strongly doubt that if they did shoot someone in that house in Pakistan a few months ago, I don't believe for 1 second it was actually Bin Laden.
Well, there were locals saying that, no, that wasn't Bin Laden, that was my neighbour Akbar. So, maybe it's just some poor innocent chap in his house that gunned down. But that's pretty much all the time we've got today. Listeners can check out Tom's work at the YouTube channel 77 Archive and the Howard Beale News Hour blog on. But thanks for coming on the show, and good luck with your new film.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Keelan. It's been great talking to you. Seriously, it's been great.
Cheers, all right. I'll talk to you.